Hey everybody, welcome to GodQuest. You're in for a treat. We're doing something new today, so let's get ready for GodQuest. Hey everybody, it's going to be a great time on GodQuest. This episode we're doing something for the very first time, but we're going to do it often moving forward. I get asked a lot of times, what do you read? What's influencing you? And I love to say three things are going to change you: the places you go, the people you meet, and the books you read. So today we're going to talk about one of the books that I have read in the last 6 or 7 months that has had a great impact on my thought processes. And it's going to be an interesting discussion tonight. It's going to be thought-provoking at the very least. And so let's get into it. The book that we're going to talk about is a book by Marie Arana. Now, this is not a religious book. This is a book about history, the history of Latin America. And it caught my attention because I pastor in California, which has a deep heritage of Hispanic culture. And then we do a lot of mission work in Central America and South America and the Caribbean. And so anything to do with mission or culture in places of the world catches my interest. And so this was one of those books that I picked up. And let me just tell you, I highly recommend this book by Marie Arana. Marie Arana is an author. She's written both fiction and nonfiction. Honestly, I've not read any of her nonfiction. This is the first book I've read by her. She is considered a very top quality writer, from what I understand, and she is the literary director for the Library of Congress. So she holds a place of prestige in the writing world. This book captured my attention because it deals with what she calls the three crucibles that have impacted Latin America. And so let's learn some things about history, and then maybe we can make some applications that are fitting. We're living in a changing world. And as I said, I live in California, and there is a deep heritage and culture that is heavily influenced by Hispanics. But as I travel the nation, the Hispanic community, the Latino community is growing everywhere. And so as we minister to people, as we're meeting new people in our community, I think it's important that we have an understanding. And as the Apostolic Church, we're seeing some tremendous revival take place in Latin America. We've interviewed Brother Mark Drost a couple of times and Brother Stephen Jones, and these are men that are very familiar with revival in Latin America. And so we've got a lot of connections there. So when you get to talking about the work of God, it's important that you understand about the culture you're going to be ministering to. It helps if we're informed. It helps if we're equipped, if we're going to be effective. And honestly, I learned a lot from this book by Marie Arana, and I want to share some of those thoughts with you. Marie Arana tells the story of Latin America through three, what she calls driving forces, these three crucibles. These three crucibles she takes from history are what she titles the book Silver, Sword, and Stone. The three crucibles of silver, sword, and stone. Silver representing exploitation, sword representing the violence, and stone representing religion. So these three things, exploitation historically, violence, we could talk about violence. We seem to know a lot about what's happened in Central America over the last number of years, but what you may not know is it's not a new thing. And that impact of the engine of fear, violence, has created that engine that has driven a lot of the things that are happening in Latin America. And then the influence of what she labels under the crucible of stone. So she takes a deep dive into how these three forces, these crucibles, have impacted Latin America. And for you and I that are ministering in the United States or doing mission in Latin America, it's going to influence the worldview of the people that we meet, how they think, and how they view not only their world, how they view the rest of the world. And so let's jump into this, and let's start with what she calls the first driving force, the first crucible, that being silver. Silver represents exploitation. As I read this book, I was shocked. I knew there had been a lot of things that had been done historically in connection with Central America and South America and the rest of the world. I thought I knew, but I was amazed at the history of how much was taken out of Latin America. What am I referring to? She refers to it as silver. It had to do with precious metals and stones. It had to do with gold and silver and copper. And the lust for precious metals, this went way back. Gold and silver were in plenty in this part of the world. You have the more ancient histories of the Incas, the Aztecs, and the Mayans. And the symbols of their glory were silver and stone. And I learned a lot about mighty Montezuma, that honestly, previously, he was just a character from a distant land that I didn't know a lot about. But I was shocked to learn the magnitude of his empire and how many people that he ruled over, and the wealth that was on display that captured the vision of the Spanish invaders, and the bloodlust for the gold that Montezuma held in his hands. And as a result, the 16th century Spain, its conquering, known as the conquistadors, they came in and began to exploit, wanting the wealth that was easily within reach. And it's an interesting history as you study these things that were done as Spain came in and began to take from the indigenous people. And I was also amazed to learn that under King Carlos, who was the king of Spain at this time, under his reign, the empire of Spain was larger than Alexander the Great and even Julius Caesar. This was being funded by the gold and the silver that was being exploited out of the New World, out of Central and South America. Gold and silver. So this was the beginning of this exploitation, how others came in and took advantage of the native or indigenous or Indian people, as they were referred to. It was gold and silver, and then copper, and then precious gems. And then as development took place, there were the fruits, the bananas, the pineapples, and more recently the United Fruit Company, its influence and how it began to take land, and the exploitation, and then the coffee regions, and then sugar throughout South America in particular. It was known as the mother of slavery. Brazil and that part of South America, the driving force behind slavery was these sugar plantations. And so it was the exploitation of outsiders coming in and pulling, as Arana describes, the silver or the value that was there. And in this colonial system, it forced the Indians and the indigenous people, as she said, to buy goods that they didn't need in exchange for the metals that Spain and Europe craved. And so this is an incredible beginning of the history of Central and South America and its impact even in 2023. Coming out of that, all of this, the disruption for the last 300 and 400 years has created. There is no other place in the world has pulled as much value out of as Central and South America, Latin America. And there is no other place on planet Earth today in 2023 that has more unequal population between rich and poor. Nowhere in Asia, nowhere in Africa, nowhere else in the world. Latin America is the most unequal. And you trace the roots of that coming out of what Arana describes as the silver crucible, leaving all kinds of things in the wake. And so you have to understand that that's the background of Central America. That's the background. Many times we say, man, why does it seem so disruptive? And we'll get to that. Well, this is part of the spawning ground of these frustrations, and even for as I mentioned a while ago, she describes the engine of fear that pushes people out, which transitions us to the second crucible she brings out. That is the crucible of the sword, representing the violence. I think it's safe to say that we are well aware of the violence, in particular of Central America. And but what you may not be aware of is that this is not a new thing. So think with me as Marie Arana brings out crucible number 1, the extreme wealth, the copper, the silver, the gold, all of this ripe vegetation and places to exploit as the world is reaching in and getting over those 300 or 400 years. Now they're achieving great wealth. She brings out the amount of wealth, how it was literally Europe was being sustained on the shoulders and the wealth that was coming out of these precious metals out of the New World. Where you've got that much money, you've got power. And where you've got that kind of power, it becomes a fight for control. And in order to maintain that control, you're going to have to exhibit strength. And so Latin America, as she says, was an abounding culture of the strong man. I like the way she said it. It has an abounding culture of the strong man because there was so much value. There was so much wealth there. And with the Caribbean on one side and the Pacific on the other side, it was easy to exploit. And it was a whole lot of opportunity for the world to sail in and take it out. And so this became a place, it became a power struggle, not only within these countries that would develop and break off from their bigger unions, and it would also become a struggle where people from other lands, foreign lands, would come in and begin to try and usurp and take and establish power because there was extreme wealth there. Spain and Portugal in particular killed or enslaved 500,000 people in one decade in Latin America. And they instituted a very rigid system of control. It led to revolts, revolutions, uprisings, slavery. It led to a violent culture that led to civil wars and a bloodlust for those precious metals and value, and to hold on to it, and armies being raised. And what I was not aware of is that our own nation, the United States, for those of you that are from the United States invaded in one way or another Latin America 28 times. I mean, that's an amazing thing that I was amazed to think that that's how much involvement we had when it came to this violence. And there was established very early a kill or be killed culture. And Mexico in particular, she spends time talking about Mexico. Mexico, 1.5 million people were killed over a 50-year period from 1860 till about 1910 because of all of the uprisings, this power struggle, these movements rising up and land being taken, and campesinos are poor indigenous workers trying to fight back, and revolutions, and on the list goes. And even people coming down and becoming a very interesting story about what happened. I think the guy's name was William Walker, went down and became the president. She talks about all that, raised up an army and took on, I mean, just crazy stuff that honestly they didn't teach in my history class. But even what we see, the drug trade that dominates so many of the newscasts and discussions that are even seem to be the driving force behind the violence that's going on in all the border discussions right now. That's not a new thing. Where did the drug trade, I don't know if you've ever thought about that. I hadn't really thought a whole lot about it until I read this book, is where did that come from? And this is important because many of the people that are coming into our churches are coming, especially from these communities, or even that are purchasing their drugs. Where are they getting drugs? Everyone's talking about fentanyl and it coming across the border. And now I understand the U.S. government is making a statement about getting involved in breaking the chain from China to Mexico and the Mexico from the border in Latin America. Where's all that? Where did all that come from? That didn't just start in this administration or the last administration. What's amazing is it started in the early 1900s. As Marie Arana shows, that it began when wealthy landowners in Latin America seized control of the Chinese railroad workers. All of us in California know about the Chinese railroad workers. There's a very rich Chinese heritage in California. The Pacific Railroad, when nobody could get it done, the Chinese were brought in because they were small and agile and smart, and they would let each other down in baskets down the side of a cliff and set off a dynamite charge, raise them right back up really quick. It would blow up, and they were able to put the Pacific Railroad across the Sierra Nevada mountains. And so that all of this is going on in the world as transportation is expanding. And here it was, these wealthy landowners in Latin America seized control of the Chinese lucrative opium fields that they had planted in Mexico in particular. This is way back in the late 1800s and 1900s. And so here was the beginning of a wealthy elite class in Latin America getting access to drug trade, and then it began to move across. So what we're dealing with when we see everything in Central America, South America, Latin America, and then we see the influence and everything, and there's a lot of talk. Understand, these are old issues. This isn't something that just developed in my lifetime or even yours. And behind this violence that we see, there was government corruption. There was inequality. There was inequity. There was injustice. There were vigilante groups that rose up to protect, and then they in turn became overbearing, and we know the results of that and how they even affect now, and some of the leading gangs in Southern California and beyond are a result of those vigilante groups. And this culture of death became embedded in Latin America. And today, Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, Colombia, Venezuela, and Brazil, 6 of the top 10 most dangerous nations in the world are in Latin America. There is an abounding culture of the strong man, as Marie Arana states. Which leads me to the third crucible, and this is where you'll understand why I bring this book to our discussion. Because her third crucible stone represents religion as a driving force of what has shaped Central America, South America, Latin America. This in particular caught my attention. And she goes back into the early foundational ancient worship of the Mayans, the Incas, and the Aztecs. And as she begins to build out the history of these people that were native to this area, were there for hundreds of years, and their stone gods, thus she calls religion this crucible of stone. Stone gods, stone pyramids, you can tour those in places in Mexico and even Copan region of Honduras. The stone pyramids, stone altars that even, she points out, led to the worship of stones and led to the worship of gemstones, and gemstones being involved in worship. And this is coming out of, there's all the interlocking of all of this with the gold and the silver and the precious things and the precious stones. And worship is tied to this. She goes into the study of how human sacrifice was connected with this stone worship and these stone gods, and literally the bodies of victims and child sacrifices, and even the heads of people that were sacrificed and even chosen, and sometimes even willingly gave their lives. And the blood would flow down the stone pyramid steps that were very steep. And the blood that was spilled upon the stones, rewards from the gods were given to the people. And these are the kinds of history that are there. So when we look at, the beheadings by the cartel and the extreme violence, understand this goes farther back than just a drug war in the last 5 years. This is more than this gang versus this gang. This is way back to some old spiritual connections that are there, that are both violent and bloody. And the stone on the graves of warriors, and it was believed when the blood was placed upon the stone, the spirits of those warriors would then inhabit the stones and bless the people. And this is in the background, and this culture of death and violence and the abounding strength of the strong man. All of this is in the deep history and culture of Latin America. Stone pyramids were, she said then, as time and conquering, and Spain, its conquistadors conquering. And notice, even in our California history, we see the interplay between faith and religion, the joining of church and state, as the priests were sent to the New World to establish the missions, but along with them were the generals and the conquistadors to keep the order. And so here, Catholicism, she says, became the stone. What was stone pyramids became stone cathedrals. And often even synchronism took place where the idols and things were brought into this new form of stone, this crucible of religion. And here it was. And it began to combine religion and power and government, and taking all of this and bringing the people in, and at times even forcing them under this realm of Catholicism. It exploded in this conquering by church and state. What's interesting is you see the impact of the stone from the ancients, and now there's even a rising of ancient religion in Central and Latin America. You see that on the streets of New York City, as many of the people are going back to some of the old spiritism that comes out of those ancient cultures. Catholicism has suffered. 2007, half of the world's Catholics lived in Latin America. Think about that. In 2007, half of the world's Catholic believers lived in Latin America. But according to Marie Arana, something interesting and explosive has taken place. She said, like Catholicism replaced ancient spiritism and stone religion of the pyramids, she said there is a new stone. And this is why I bring the book. She said the new stone, the new wave of religion, is Pentecostalism. Pentecostalism. And she said Pentecostalism is replacing Catholicism. Until now, 2023, over 40% of all the Pentecostals alive on planet Earth live in Latin America, when just a few short years ago, 2007, over half of the world's Catholics lived in Latin America. Now, over 40% of the Pentecostals on planet Earth live in Latin America. The global South is exploding with Pentecostalism. Christianity is being driven by the Pentecostal movement, especially in Latin America. And where the West, Europe, the United States, Canada, there seems to be a cooling of faith. There's a rejection of faith, and churches are being closed down and turned into restaurants and torn down for condominiums to be built, and museums and places to go look at old buildings, and they're empty, and basic traditional religion seems to be closing in the Western world of Europe and the United States and Canada. But not so in Latin America. Pentecostalism is driving faith in Latin America. And this was interesting. Arana brings out that the Catholic Church understood this and recognized that something had to be done because for the Catholic faith, the future of Catholicism depends upon Latin America. She says this is why Pope Benedict, who was a German by nationality, resigned in 2013. And in his place, Pope Francis, who was from Argentina, was placed in the position as Pope, which is interesting. He was the very first non-European Pope since the 8th century when Gregory III was the Pope, who was a Syrian Pope. Now think about that. Look at everything. This Pope, Pope Francis, has been in the news a lot, and his ideas and seeming to be very communistic and Marxist at times and very liberal. There is an attempt to try and gather back, and thus there is a movement. 40% of the Catholics in the world are in Latin America. Now you understand why this particular pope was chosen. It was a move to try and save Catholicism because Pentecostalism is pushing. Now, I had a lot of fun as I read this portion because I'm Pentecostal and I love what's happening in Latin America and I see the wave of revival. But I was interested as I listened to Miss Arana write. She says that they don't see Pentecostalism as a religion, but they see it as the way. The way. Man, I like that. I mean, that is so descriptive because for me, Pentecostalism, I don't even think of it like religion. For me, it's a way of life. And she brings that out in the book, is that this is one of the reasons that Pentecostalism is growing, because there is all of the issues with the violence and the crucibles of sword and the crucibles of silver and all of the things that have been done under the banner of church and state. Now Pentecostalism comes in requiring accountability, requiring a real conversion, an experience with God, not just church attendance, not just showing up with an offering on Sunday, but here a conversion, a Pentecostal experience. There's a rejection of immoral living because now you are the dwelling place. And if you're going to be the dwelling place of God and you're going to walk in the way, you're not serving a religion. You are now the dwelling place of God. This is all she talks about this in this book. And she describes it as a prosperity doctrine. But she says prosperity, why? Because when you remove alcoholism, you remove the price of paying for your alcohol and your drugs, and prostitution is no longer acceptable, and now you're not drinking, and you have to pay tithe, and you have to give offering, and you have to attend church, and you have to have a conversion. She said, no wonder this is revolutionizing poor people. It's bringing structure to their life. And she used this terms, and I love it. She said it was upward mobility. Man, I got excited. That part was worth buying this book because that is what the gospel does. We call it redemptive lift around here, but she describes it as upward mobility. And so as I read, there's a quote in here. She says, the evangelical church is being credited with the creation of a new middle class. The evangelical church is being driven by Pentecostalism in Latin America. So I think now you can figure out why I got so excited about this book, Silver, Sword, and Stone by Marie Arana. It's not a Christian book, and she's an outstanding writer. She can talk about reality like it's fiction. It's amazing how she's able to put her words together. But what I'm left with as I close the pages of this book, and mine's all marked up. I've revisited it several times. As I look at what she describes as silver, sword, and stone, the precious gold. The Bible teaches us that we're going to be tried in the fire, but we're going to come out like pure gold. I also see where the Word of God is called the sword of the Lord. And that Bible is the sword that we fight our battles with. The Word of God coming through our lives, the power of the Holy Ghost purifying us like pure gold. And then we've got a stone, the stone that the builders rejected. This rock is Christ Jesus. I tell you what, as I read this secular writer describing the history and the culture and of this amazing place, beauty, if you've ever been to I've been to every country other than Panama and Central America. I've been to South America. It's an amazing land. Latin America has a wealth of food and culture, and they're amazing people. But more than the beauty, more than the culture, more than the food, there is an apostolic Pentecostal revival. And that revival is crossing borders. It's in our communities. It's opportunity. I want to challenge you in GodQuest. Get in this wild world of wonder, the Missio Dei, the mission of God. Look at what God is doing, silver, sword, and stone. I challenge you, take a read. It'll spur a thought. Thank you for being with us. Subscribe. Tell somebody about GodQuest. I look forward to our next episode together. God bless you.